Alright, I thought this could be an interesting idea for a video. These are every single team's most underrated players. So all 32 teams, we're going to go alphabetically here. So let's just get into it, starting off with the Arizona Cardinals. For the Cardinals, I'm actually going to go Marquise Brown. I think people talk about Marquise Brown as if he's some, like, just garbage player that, like, doesn't belong in the NFL or something. Right? They talk about him as a complete bust. And, like, listen, I didn't love it when they traded a first-round pick for him. I didn't. But at the same time, like, I don't know. I think he's still an effective player and a good number 2 option, and I thought played really well for Arizona before getting hurt. So I'm going to go Marquise Brown for the Cardinals. Moving on to the Atlanta Falcons, I am going to go with Kyle Pitts. People act like Kyle Pitts, another guy who's like, oh, he was drafted 4th overall and hasn't, been a superstar yet. What a disaster. He's been a really good tight end for them for, 2 years now. He's been one of the better receiving tight ends in the league. He didn't have he's not a great fantasy football tight end, but PFF had him ranked as the 11th best tight end in football last year. He's been a top 10 tight end basically for both years he's been in the league at a position that notoriously just takes some time to develop. And you don't jump into the league as a superstar right away at the tight end position almost ever. So yeah, gonna go there. For the Baltimore Ravens, I am going Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews, I think, is their most underrated player. Andrews gets a ton of credit. People talk about Andrews as a great player. And when you watch the game, he's someone who, he'll be on some promos and things like that. But I don't think people really talk about him the way they should, which is one of the best players in football. That's what he's been. I mean, he's been one of the best tight ends in the league. To me, I think I would probably put him as the second best tight end in the league these past couple of years, only behind, obviously Travis Kelce has to be number 1. Next up is the Buffalo Bills, who I'm going to go Jordan Poyer, the safety, who been in the league for a minute now. He's, currently 32 years old, but still consistently putting out, I don't know. I feel like he's been a consistent, top 15 safety in the league for the past 7 years or so. He's been so good for them, and he doesn't get the credit, partially just because safeties in general don't get the credit that they typically do, and there's other stars on that Buffalo team that tend to get some more love, but he definitely deserves some attention, so I'm putting him on the list right here. As for Carolina, they're an interesting one, and there's definitely a couple different ways you could go with them. I do think that kind of their stars we talk about. I think we talk about Derek Brown. I think we talk about J.C. Horn. I think we do kind of cover their good players for the most part. And again, I'm kind of factoring in no one talks about offensive linemen really at all. So they have some good ones that don't get talked about because they're offensive linemen. I think I'm going to go DJ Chark for them because I do think DJ Chark did a lot of really nice things, and he's been kind of a bit inconsistent, but I thought he meant a lot to that Lions offense when he was out there, and has meant a lot to the Jaguars offense when he was, good with them for a bit of time. So he's a new player that I'm putting there, but I am going to put him there. As for the Bears, I'm sure Bears fans are screaming, who's super underrated? Justin Fields. No one talks about Justin Fields. Not going to go there. I'm instead going to go Tevin Jenkins, the former second-round pick who barely played in 2021, only still had about 500-plus snaps in 2022. He is the offensive guard, but he was he graded out really well. PFF had him graded as the 3rd best guard in football last year when he was out there. So I think he deserves some credit that he doesn't tend to get because, again, offensive lineman hurt, and also just the but I feel like in general, even for the fact that he's a guard who doesn't get talked about much, I feel like we should still talk about him a little bit more. So Cincinnati Bengals are next on the list, and I'm going Orlando Brown Jr. I think Orlando Brown Jr., another new addition, but people kind of talked about him as this, I feel like when he was sort of, going through contract negotiations with the Chiefs, people kind of talk about him as if he's not very good or something like that. I think he's a debatably top 10 tackle in the league still. I think he's great. I don't know why people hate on him. I've always been a big fan of Orlando Brown Jr. So yeah, he is my pick there. Next up is the Cleveland Browns, which I'm going David Njoku, the 3rd tight end to make this list already. I guess people don't talk about tight ends the way they should. It's interesting because, we always kind of felt like with him, if he could just put it all together, he could be so good. He's always been kind of been like solid, but last year I really thought was the first year he like said like, no, I am an elite player in this league. And it's funny because if you look at his like stats, like look at his PFF grades throughout the course of his career, they've actually been pretty good these past 3 seasons. So last year was certainly the best year, but he's been a relatively consistent player at this point in his career. So yeah, I have him as the next player on my list. Then we're moving over to the Dallas Cowboys, another one where I'm sure some fans are going to say, Dak Prescott, he never gets the credit he deserves. Instead, I'm going with another new addition. Brandon Cooks has just been so underrated for so long for Houston, and hopefully now that he's with Dallas, he's going to start getting some extra attention as he just, again, in a tough situation, he's still been able to do some great stings. So, yeah, definitely feel like I have to put him on the list. Next up on the list, I think I'm going to go Alex Singleton, the linebacker last year, who really just had a breakout year last year. I mean, I thought he did so many great things for Denver and was really good at several different things. He could stop the run very well, and he could cover very well, and was a huge part of what made that defense so effective. PFF had him graded as a top 10 linebacker in the league last year, and he's a guy who I feel like a good chunk of people watching this video are going to say, who? Well, he's a good player and deserves some credit. So next up, the Detroit Lions, Amon-Ra St. Brown is my pick. I thought that he was a borderline elite player last year for Dallas. PFF had him graded as the number 2 wide receiver in football. Now, when you play the slot, it's easier to rack up some better PFF grades worth mentioning, so that factored in. But he was so great for them and meant so much for that roster. I got to put him on the list, I think. We then have the Green Bay Packers. The Green Bay Packers, another team that, again, several ways you could go with them, but I think to me, the way that I'm going to go, I think I'm still going to go Rashawn Gary, who got banged up last year and didn't look quite as dominant as he looked 2 years ago, but we don't really talk about Rashawn Gary as a guy who, at his best is like an elite level player. So Rashawn Gary next up on the list. As for the Houston Texans, the next team on the list, I'm going Laramie Tunsil. Laramie Tunsil was awesome last year. He had a couple of down years, and I think the fact that he got traded to the Texans for multiple draft picks, people have kind of mocked a little bit, but he's been really good. So no, I'm going Laramie Tunsil, and then I'm also going to go for the Indianapolis Colts. I'm going to go Michael Pittman, I think a wide receiver they've asked a lot from him. The Colts have. The poor Michael Pittman is constantly asked to do a ton, but he's typically delivered and been like I don't know if he's been like a great number 1 option, but he's been a good number 1 option at the very least. The Jacksonville Jaguars next up on the list, I'm going Tyson Campbell, the player who was drafted 33rd overall and has really turned into a number 1 corner. He doesn't get talked about a lot, but again, PFF had him rated as the 7th highest cornerback in the league. We don't really talk about him that way, but no, he's been a borderline top 10 corner in the league. As for the Kansas City Chiefs, the next team on the list, it's Patrick Mahomes. I mean, why does no one really talk about Patrick Mahomes and how great he is? No, okay, obviously I'm kidding. I think that my real pick is going to be, I probably would have said Nick Bolton, but I thought that he had such a good Super Bowl. People kind of talked about him a lot in that Super Bowl, so I'll go I think I'm going to go L'Jarius Sneed. Very good corner for them for quite some time. Not for quite some time, but he has been a very good corner. Has graded incredibly well. I think definitely deserves the credit. So Raiders next up on the list. I could go Max Crosby, but I feel like he gets credit. Maybe he's a bit underrated, but I still feel like he does get some credit. I'm going to go Jacoby Myers. I think Jacoby Myers was really good last year for New England, and people kind of talked about like getting him and losing Waller as like a downgrade. I would at least put it as a lateral move, in my opinion. Next up is going to be the Chargers. I'm going Asante Samuel Jr., who, maybe gets a lot of credit due to his name, for sure. But like he was really good last year. He legitimately lived up to that hype. And I think people kind of had originally talked about him, including myself, as a guy who really only got hyped up due to his name. Well, last year he deserved the hype. So yeah, going with that. And for the Rams, I think I'm going to go a quarterback finally. I think I'm going to go Stetson Bennett. No, I'm going to go Matt Stafford here. I think he's gotten underrated at this point. I think that, like, I know last year wasn't great, but he's Stafford. He has his ebbs and flows. He got hurt. He's not like, people talk about him like he's 47 or something. And listen, not every quarterback is going to play to 45 like Brady, but still, he's 35. I think he's still got at least a couple good years left in him. I'm not selling all of my Matthew Stafford stock just yet. And you know what? With Miami Dolphins, I'm going to keep the quarterback train rolling. I'm going to go Tua, who I think at this point, I think he was overrated at a certain point. I think he's gotten underrated at this point. Maybe it wasn't overrated. Maybe he was just properly rated. But I think that people act like all he did was throw it to Tyreek Hill 5 yards down the field and he ran the rest of the way. Okay, that happens sometimes, but he did a lot of nuances that really helped out that roster. So I think he deserves a lot of credit that he really hasn't received. So Tua, he makes the list here. Next up is the Minnesota Vikings, who are another team where it's like, I feel like a good chunk of their stars get credit. Like, people talk about Justin Jefferson. People talk about Kirk Cousins. I'm not sure if you call him a star, but I talk about him. People talk about Marcus Davenport and Danielle Hunter. People don't talk about Christian Darrisaw as a tackle for them. He's, again, PFF's second-rated tackle last year. No one talks about him in that way, I don't see. So I think he's very good and very underrated. New England, you could argue Mac Jones. I'm sure podcast co-host Kyle would argue that, but actually I'm not even sure if he would. But some people would argue that, but I don't know. I feel like we kind of properly evaluate him. There's so many players in the secondary that you could definitely make the argument for. Marcus Jones, Jack Jones, Jonathan Jones, all the Joneses, really. I think I'll go, I think, I'm going to go Kyle Duggar in the secondary. I think he's sort of a Swiss Army knife, does it all at the safety position, and I think that value that he brings to New England, for what they want to do, it's a perfect fit, and he's been really great for them. So, doesn't get a ton of credit, but again, I think deserves it for sure. So, next up on the list is the New Orleans Saints. Who is the most underrated player for the New Orleans Saints? Another team that does kind of get the attention, again, their stars get the attention, but, like Demario Davis, you could argue is underrated, actually. I think I'm going to go Tyrann Mathieu, though, as the most underrated player, who somewhere along the way, people started turning on him and saying he's not that great. I think he's great. I think he's incredible. I think he's really good and deserves the hype that he gets. Kansas City asked him to do so much, and so because of that, there would be some losses along the way, maybe more so than your average safety, just because your average safety isn't covering number one receivers. But Mathieu has been incredible, and he was great with the Saints last year, so he's going to be my number one pick. Next up is the New York Giants, who, Daniel Jones is an interesting figure here. I think Giants fans probably overrate him, but I think that the general public probably underrates him a little bit. So you could definitely argue that he should be an underrated player. Again, it's kind of tough because like Leonard Williams, Dexter Lawrence, Kayvon Thibodeau, three very good players. They get their credit. Saquon Barkley, he gets his credit, I think. Isaiah Hodgins did not really get a lot of credit last year. In fact, what's almost used as a punchline of like, oh, your best receiver is Isaiah Hodgins. Well, okay, that's not what you thought was going to happen going into the year, but he was legitimately good, and I don't think that we should hold that against him, that there wasn't a lot of talent around him. I thought that he, proved he was more than just like a role player last year, and I'm excited to see what they can do with a full offseason of using him to his abilities and stuff like that. So next up is the New York Jets. The Jets are another just fascinating discussion because there's a ton of talent across the board with this team. A lot of guys on their roster do get the credit. Again, it's one of those things where it's like Quinnen Williams gets the credit he deserves. Sauce Gardner got the credit he deserves. Aaron Rodgers. Yeah, we talk about Aaron Rodgers a little bit, I think. Who is the most underrated player? Maybe this is a weird take, but I think I'm actually going to go Garrett Wilson as the most underrated player. The guy just won Offensive Rookie of the Year, but I don't know if we talk about him the way we should. He feels like a number one guy. When I watch his tape, I'm often blown away by how good it really is. So I think I'm going to go Garrett Wilson, although I will say I think most of the players on the Jets get properly rated. I think that's one of the teams we tend to evaluate pretty well for whatever reason. The Philadelphia Eagles, maybe Jalen Hurts might be an argument to be made because I think while people talk about him as great, I don't know if we really talk about him as an elite level player the way that we potentially should, but there's one player who's one of the most underrated players in the league who has to be the guy here, and that's Josh Sweat, who, he doesn't get credit for being a starter because they have Hassan Reddick and Brandon Graham, but like he had more snaps than Brandon Graham did last year. He's been graded one of the better edge rushers consistently for a couple years now, and is he's a star level edge that we just don't talk about him in that way. So yeah, Josh Sweat, not just the most underrated player for the Eagles, but one of the most underrated players just in general. The Pittsburgh Steelers, if you ask them, every single player on their roster is underrated. That's tends to be how they view it. Again, Steelers, very passionate fan base, which is fun. I enjoy it. I think I'm gonna go Cam Hayward though, the interior defensive lineman. Which when smart people do their top 10 defensive lineman rankings, or top 10 interior defensive lineman rankings, they tend to put him there. But he's a Hall of Fame level player in my opinion, who just doesn't get the credit he deserves, I think, in terms of the general public, due to kind of positional, the way people pay attention to that position. So, again, everyone talks about him as great that talks about him, but he doesn't get talked about maybe the way he should. Next up is the San Francisco 49ers, who I think I'm going to kind of continue the interior defensive lineman train going a little bit with Javon Hargrave. I mean, they spent a ton of money for him as a free agent this offseason, and really no one talked about it. I don't know why. Again, there's other guys on the list for the 49ers, maybe Brock Purdy, who's kind of simultaneously overrated and underrated, depending on who you ask, I would say. Maybe Trent Williams, you could even argue, because, well, he certainly gets credit. I don't know if he fully gets credit as like the elite, one of the best players in football conversation type of guys that maybe he should. Fred Warner, again, guy who I think is the best linebacker in the league, maybe only gets talked about as like the fourth best linebacker in the league in some camps, but I think that I like the pick there of Hargrave. Going on to the Seattle Seahawks, another fascinating team here, because again, there's several ways you could go with Seattle, but I think I'm going to actually go quarterback. I'm going to go Geno Smith. I think people kind of view Smith as like wow, that was weird. He had a good year, but he was really good last year. He deserved the credit that he got, I think, and then some. So I was blown away by him. I am going to go with Geno Smith as my pick. For the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are next on the list, which another team that they got so much attention these past few years, feels like the guys that are good got the credit that they deserve. Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, we talk about them as great receivers. I think they there was a time when Evans was pretty massively underrated, but I think that time has passed. I think we talk about it now. We talk about Tristan Wirfs. We talk about a lot of these great players on defense. The one player that maybe we don't talk enough about is Jamel Dean, who gets some easier assignments as the number 2 corner, but really lives up to it and very rarely gets beat. He has a pretty consistent hit rate. So for me, Jamel Dean is going to be my pick. As for the Tennessee Titans, they're a team that have some rough spots on their roster, I think is reasonable to say, but some real bright spots as well. And probably, I think Arden Key gets an honorable mention here, but for me, Jeffrey Simmons is the guy. I think, again, people talk about him as a top 10 interior defensive lineman, but I don't know if people talk about him as debatably these, I don't know if you could argue he's first or second best because of Aaron Donald and Chris Jones, but he's in the top 5, I think. He means so much to that roster that, yeah, I'm going to put him on the list. And finally, last but not least, the Washington Commanders. You could maybe say Chase Young. Some people would. You could maybe say Jacoby Brissett. Some people would. I am going to say Montez Sweat is the most underrated edge rusher, or most underrated Washington Commander, I should say. Again, guy who's he's played at elite levels for Washington, deserves a ton of credit. I'm giving it to him here. Those are my picks for every team's most underrated player. Who else is underrated? Let me know in the comments below. Or do you disagree? Did I say someone you actually think is properly rated or even overrated? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.